Rome, 64 years after the birth of Christ. In the marble atrium of a nobleman's villa, torches burn like hungry eyes. Perfumed smoke winds through the columns, and a girl of 15 is told to smile. Her name is Thessia, and she was born free in Thrace. But tonight, she wears a silk tunic, not of her choosing, and no one calls her by name. A senator's wife plucks at her sleeve and tells her to move faster. There are guests arriving, and she is part of the pleasure. The first rule of survival in the Roman elite's household was silence. Thessia had learned that quickly. When the steward beat a slave boy for dropping a pitcher, no one gasped. When the mistress demanded her wine be warmed with honey and the servant brought it cool, he was stripped and flogged in front of the guests, and they applauded. But tonight was not punishment. Tonight was celebration. A guest of high rank had returned from campaign in Britannia, and the senator, her new master, would spare no decadence in welcoming him. In the courtyard, long couches had been laid with purple cushions. Bronze lamps flickered along mosaic floors, and on each low table rested dishes of roasted peacock, sea urchin, and lamb drenched in myrtle oil. Amphorae of wine spiced, aged, and blood dark stood ready, but what they thirsted for could not be poured. The guests arrived masked, laughing behind painted wooden visages of fauns and gods. Their sandals were dusted with gold powder, their robes stiff with embroidery. They sat with gluttonous ease, hands already outstretched for meat and flesh. Thessia was instructed to serve wine, but not to speak. She moved from man to man, her shoulders bare, her feet bleeding from sandal straps too tight. One man pulled her close to whisper something, but his breath was thick with fermented grapes and cruelty. Another reached out and pressed 2 fingers to her lips, laughing when she flinched. It was a game. It was always a game. She saw other girls too, older, quieter. One had a necklace of silver coins, each one stamped with the senator's insignia. Another wore only a belt of bells, designed to ring each time she bent. The rules of the banquet were not spoken aloud, but lived in the rhythm of power. Nobles devoured, and slaves endured. As the sky darkened, the music swelled. A flute played in the shadows, and someone began to chant a hymn to Bacchus. Thessia was summoned to the center of the gathering. Her cup was taken. Her tunic was pulled at the hem. She was told to dance, not for joy, but for entertainment. And as laughter rose like thunder around her trembling body, she understood that this was not a night of feasting. It was a ritual, a spectacle, and she was the offering. There was no such thing as a vomitorium. That was a lie passed down through centuries by those who wished to mock Roman decadence without ever understanding its full rot. The truth was far worse. The room Thessia entered was not a hallway, but a chamber carved with purpose. A narrow drain ran through the center of the floor like a wound. The walls were tiled in green glass, smooth and cold, and in one corner sat a bronze basin filled with a mix of myrrh oil and vinegar. No one explained what it was for. They never did. Thessia had been pulled from the banquet without warning, her wrist gripped by a eunuch dressed in white linen. The guests had begun to sweat with wine and lust, and her refusal to dance had not gone unnoticed. She was told that before she returned, she must be made more presentable. That word presentable sounded like kindness. It wasn't. Inside the chamber stood a noblewoman, perhaps in her 40s, skin like alabaster, lips stained with mulberry dye. She did not greet Thessia. She merely gestured to the small stool beside her, then to the long-handled feather brush she held like a weapon. Thessia sat. She knew better than to question. The woman began to scrub her arms, her back, even the insides of her thighs with scented water and salt. When Thessia winced, the woman clicked her tongue. Do not flinch. The guests are sensitive to smell. Behind her, another servant prepared a paste of crushed mint and goat milk. It would be used to coat her underarms. And after that, a thin gold powder would be dusted across her chest to make her appear more radiant in torchlight. The most painful part came last. A slender hook used to remove the tiny hairs along her jawline, not for hygiene, for aesthetic, for control. She bled in 3 places. No one offered a cloth. Then came the ritual of emptying, not of the body's contents, but of its resistance. Thessia was handed a cup of thick purple liquid, a mixture of herbs meant to dull shame and quicken obedience. She drank it because she had seen what happened to those who refused. The noblewoman finally leaned in and whispered, "You'll be serving Lucius Severus directly. He has paid handsomely. You will not speak, you will not eat, you will smile." The door opened. She was returned to the gathering, but something had shifted. Her limbs felt distant, her mind fogged. Around her, the music had grown louder, the guests more unhinged. A young man vomited into a marble basin and laughed as he reached for another fig soaked in honey. Thessia was placed beside him and told to hold the bowl steady next time. Not for cleanliness, but for convenience. This was the Roman elite's true indulgence, not just consumption, but the transformation of people into objects. The vomitorium may not have existed, but the dehumanization did, and it was far more grotesque. The senator's estate was a world within a world, and its darkest truths were buried beneath the polished marble floors. Below the banquet hall, where laughter echoed and peacock feathers brushed across wine-drenched lips, ran a corridor few guests ever saw. It smelled of damp earth and old metal. This was where contracts were kept, not on parchment, but in bruises and whispered warnings. Thessia was escorted there the morning after the banquet, her limbs aching, her mind still blurred by the drink. She had not slept. Sleep was no longer hers to command. The steward, a narrow-eyed man with oil-slicked hair, led her through a rusted gate and down the passage. She passed rooms with iron doors, some ajar, revealing mats of straw and bowls of water. No beds, no windows, just silence. He stopped before a chamber lit by a single oil lamp. Inside stood an elderly scribe hunched over a wax tablet. A small table separated them, and on it lay a bronze collar, open like the jaws of an animal. The steward spoke without looking at her. "Thessia of Thrace, you are now under exclusive patronage of Lucius Severus, legate of the 13th Legion, guest of the house. For one lunar cycle, you belong to him. You will wear the mark of his right. If you disobey, he may return you broken." The words were formal, recited from memory. They held no warmth, only weight. Thessia said nothing. What was there to say? She had no rights, no voice. She was a body traded in the currency of power. The scribe approached and held up the collar. It was light, yet it chilled her skin like ice. He fastened it around her neck, then sealed the hinge with a pin. It did not hurt, but it hummed with humiliation. Lucius had not even bothered to appear. His signature would be added later. For now, the collar spoke for him. It was engraved with the image of a wolf devouring a deer, the sigil of his family. Beneath it, the Latin phrase, "Voluntate Domini," by the will of the master. Thessia was then handed a set of new garments, thin white linen, transparent in light, designed not for protection, but for display. She dressed without comment. The steward dismissed her with a nod. "Do not forget your station. He likes silence. He likes obedience. He likes when you pretend to enjoy it." She returned to the surface like a ghost. The villa had resumed its rhythm, birds chirped in the garden, servants swept the steps, and the noblewomen gossiped about theater and politics. No one asked where she had gone. No one noticed the collar, or if they did, they smiled, because in this world, it was not a shackle. It was proof she had been chosen, and to them, that was the highest form of honor a girl like her could hope for. The garden was not on any map of the estate. It was hidden behind a colonnade that most servants were forbidden to enter, flanked by statues of gods with broken eyes. The path to it twisted through hedges pruned with surgical precision, each leaf sharpened to a point. Thessia had only heard of it in murmurs, a place where the air smelled too sweet, and nothing was ever quite what it seemed. They called it the Garden of Little Gods. She was summoned there on the third evening of her contract, her collar polished, her linen robe replaced with one dyed a pale violet that clung to her skin like mist. A maid brushed her hair with rose oil until it glistened under torchlight, then led her in silence through the halls and out into the evening air. The garden was drenched in golden lamplight, its walkways paved in polished obsidian that reflected the stars. Along the outer edge stood marble alcoves, each shaped like a miniature temple, and in the center, a low stage made of red-veined stone rose above a shallow pool. Around it lounged the noble senators in plum-striped togas, priestesses with gold coiled around their arms, and young men in masks sculpted to resemble Apollo and Dionysus. They sipped from chalices and plucked fruit from slave-held trays, but their eyes never left the stage. Not when Thessia entered, not when she was guided to the center and told to kneel. A man stepped forward, lean, pale, with a voice like poisoned honey. Lucius Severus. His mask rested in one hand, and in the other he held a scroll. He read aloud, not to her, but to the audience. It was a scene from a play, an ancient myth about a nymph who defied a god and was punished with transformation. As he spoke, musicians began to play, flutes and lyres, a melody of something sacred twisted into something profane. Thessia was told to rise, to move as the nymph had terrified, pleading, submitting. It was a performance, they said, a tribute to art, but her body was not acting. Her trembling was real, her breath shallow, her pulse frantic. Each step she took was directed by Lucius, who narrated her despair as if it were entertainment. The nobles clapped softly, smiling. Some reached for each other, their hands already exploring beneath silk. Others whispered guesses about which scene would follow. Would she become a tree, or a beast, or stone? Behind the performance was a cruelty more refined than the whip. This was theater, yes, but not for the gods. It was for men who believed themselves divine. In that garden, every mask became a mirror, reflecting not mythology but appetite. When the performance ended, no one applauded. They simply rang tiny silver bells to summon the next act. Thessia stepped down from the stage, heart hollowed. She had not played a nymph. She had played herself broken into pieces and dressed as myth so they could forget she was real. The moon hung low over the villa, pale and swollen like an unblinking eye. Thessia was roused before dawn by the same silent maid who had dressed her for the garden. No words were exchanged, only a gesture, a finger pressed to the lips, then a nod toward the long corridor that led beneath the estate. She followed barefoot, the marble cold against her soles. Down they went, past the slave quarters, past the armory, into a wing of the villa reserved for ceremonies too strange for daylight. The chamber they entered was vast, with walls of black stone and no windows. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting shadows that slithered like serpents. In the center stood a circle of noble guests, cloaked and hooded, their faces half-lit and unreadable. A priestess waited at the front, draped in crimson silk, her eyes rimmed with kohl, her voice low as she chanted to gods no longer named in public. Thessia was led to the center. Around her, the guests whispered, not in Latin, but in a dialect meant to mimic ancient rites, half nonsense, half invocation. She could smell wine, but stronger than that was the scent of musk, of sweat, of animal fur. From the far end of the room emerged a young greyhound, its coat brushed to a silver sheen, its collar woven with pearls. It was led by a boy in chains, and when the dog reached the circle, the priestess raised her hands and declared that the marriage would begin. Thessia's breath caught. She had heard rumors of such ceremonies, humiliations disguised as divine plays, a bride for the god Anubis, a virgin wedded to the wind. But this was not theater. This was a ritual designed to degrade. The collar around her neck was removed. In its place, a silken one was fastened, dyed indigo, threaded with bells. A gold leash was clipped to its ring and handed to the boy beside the dog. The priestess spoke of union, of obedience, of the shedding of ego. Then Thessia was commanded to kneel. She obeyed, not because she understood, but because disobedience was a greater cruelty. The boy circled her with the leash, walking slowly, dragging the bells in a pattern as the guests hummed their approval. Some wept from laughter. Others watched in reverent silence, as if this mockery were sacred. When the ritual concluded, a fig soaked in wine was placed on Thessia's tongue, the fruit of devotion. The priestess called it, her lips burned, her eyes stung. No one helped her stand. Later, back in her chamber, she vomited until nothing remained, not even tears. The silken collar had left a rash along her throat. She did not cover it. Let them see. Let them remember. But of course, they wouldn't. For them, It had been a game, a dream, a story they would retell between laughter and wine. For Thessia, it was a scar that could not be named. Years later, when the villa had fallen silent and its gardens overgrown with weeds, a trial was held in a tribunal chamber near the forum. The walls were lined with senators in dyed togas, their rings glinting beneath high windows where dust hung like judgment. Scrolls were read aloud, lists of accusations, testimonies from former slaves, inventories of missing girls whose names had never been recorded. Lucius Severus did not attend. He had died during a hunting trip along the Appian Way, thrown from his chariot, his skull dashed against the stones. Some whispered it was divine justice. Others said it was simply chance. The court, bound by Roman order, did not care either way. The case was not about punishment. It was about optics. Thessia sat in the shadows, cloaked in gray, older now, though the scars on her body had not aged. She was not called to testify. Her name was not on the parchment. Her memories did not count as evidence. Instead, men she had once served now spoke with solemn voices about excesses and youthful misjudgments. They blamed the wine, the times, the culture of indulgence. One senator suggested that what occurred was no different than the rites of Bacchus described in the old texts, a cultural tradition misunderstood by modern eyes. The room nodded. Pens scratched. Verdicts formed like fog. No one mentioned the collars, or the garden stage, or the fig pressed into a trembling mouth while strangers chanted. No one recited the lines Thessia had been forced to memorize as she danced half-naked before men who thought themselves gods. They spoke only of property damages, of reputation, of heirs and estates. When the final judgment was passed, it was not a conviction, it was an expulsion. The estate would be sold, the remaining slaves redistributed, the crimes unspoken. Rome had decided not to forgive, but to forget. After the hearing, Thessia walked alone through the ruins of the villa. The marble floors were cracked now, the silk draperies long gone. Ivy had crept into the garden, covering the red-veined stone with green. She stood where the stage had once been, where she had been made to play a myth so they could deny her humanity. She reached down and pulled a piece of broken tile from the pool's edge. It was etched with the image of a wolf, the Severus family's sigil. She dropped it into the earth and walked away. History would not record her. No statue would bear her name. The archives of Rome would speak only of estates and bloodlines, of noble families and their legacies. But somewhere beyond that silence lived the truth, not in scrolls, but in scars, in vanished girls, in eyes that had seen too much. Thessia was never meant to be remembered. But memory, like ivy, finds its way through cracks, and in that quiet garden of cruelty, something remained that could never be erased.